Please be seated. It's really great to see you all here. Thank you so much. I know some of you traveled from long distances to be out here and pay honor to our friend and colleague and teacher, Eva Brann. So thank you for coming. I'm going to just say a little bit about how this will work. So tomorrow morning, there will be another event at 10 a.m. in this auditorium, and we will have two speakers, Miss Joan Silver, and Miss Janet Doherty. And they will be, they'll speak one after the other, and then afterwards we'll have a question period. And we're going to do that tonight. So tonight we have Mr. Peter Kalkavage and Mr. Eric Salem, and they have translated many works together with Miss Brann, including the Meno and the Phaedo, and some of us have read them with great pleasure. So I'm just going to start things off right now and introduce Mr. Peter Kalkavage. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. My talk this evening stands guilty of a breach in protocol. I shall refer to Miss Brann as Eva. That is who she is to me. As a colleague, Eva has given me unfailing personal support over the years. She is my Plato co-translator, with whom Eric Salem and I enjoyed countless hours, blessed hours, of hard work seasoned with hilarity, and the Dionysian delights of open, uncensored speech about pretty much everything. Above all, Eva is my friend. Her sparkling company, whether in person or over the phone, is always an adventure and a joy. When I first told Eva about an event in her honor, she balked. Not just me, she protested. If celebrate her we must, then it should be a threefold tribute to her, to Jacob Klein, and to the college. This was typical of Eva's generosity and her deep awareness of personal and intellectual debts. When I asked Eva what I should talk about, she said, Plato. My talk this evening is an attempt to honor Eva's wishes. It is about recollection in the Meno. Like many others, I learned the most about how to read a Platonic dialogue from Jacob Klein's commentary, which inspired many of the ideas in this talk. The Meno is also the dialogue that Eva, Eric Salem, and I worked on most recently and finished during the year of COVID. We dedicated our translation to the college. We did so for two reasons. One was that the Meno confronts the very possibility of learning, and so has a special place in the St. John's program. As the first dialogue that the freshmen read, it is our portal to Plato and to all the philosophic works that follow. The other reason was that the roots of our translation project were planted deep in the soil of the college and its spirit of collaboration and shared inquiry. Without the college, we would not have been possible. The Meno is a beautifully crafted product of the philosophical imagination. It is a drama in three main acts. In the first, Meno tries and fails to answer Socrates' question, what is virtue? In the second, Socrates tries, through myth and geometric problem solving, to combat Meno's deadly paradox that makes learning impossible. He argues that what we call learning is in fact a process of recollection, anamnesis, the going back to things already seen but forgotten. In the third and final act, Socrates and Meno all but abandon recollection and descend into the underworld of conventional opinions about teaching and learning. At the end of the dialogue, after it has been shown that there are no teachers of virtue, Socrates tells Meno that if someone could transmit political wisdom to another, he would be among the living what Homer in the Odyssey says Tiresias is among the dead. He alone has his wits about him, while the rest flit about as shades. The Meno begins with a question. Can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is something teachable or not teachable, but attainable through practice? Or is it neither attainable through practice nor learnable, but instead comes to human beings by nature or in some other way? Meno does not ask how virtue is acquired, or how he, Meno, might acquire virtue. He asks whether Socrates can tell Meno how virtue is acquired. This points to one of the dialogue's central themes, wise speech as a commodity that can pass from one owner to another, even one city to another. Meno hopes to extract from Socrates an impressive answer, a piece of intellectual wealth that he can take back with him to his native Thessaly. Socrates responds to Meno's question with a parody of the fancy speech that was the hallmark of the sophist Gorgias, by whom Meno has obviously been imprinted. Socrates admits to poverty in point of wisdom. In fact, he is so far from knowing how virtue is acquired that he doesn't at all know even what virtue is. Socrates then lures Meno into trying to answer this very question. What is virtue? Socrates' admission of ignorance is perplexing. How does Socrates, how does anyone know that he does not know? Can I know that I do not know without knowing something about what I do not know? How has it come to light for me that virtue, or anything else I find puzzling, has become dark? Not dark in general, but dark in some pointed, determinate respect. How, in other words, is a genuine question, a question that springs from acknowledged ignorance and a desire to know, possible? Meno's first answer to Socrates' question is a list that gives examples of virtue, but does not state what the examples have in common. There's the virtue of a man, a woman, a child, a slave, a young person, and an old one. The list reports what is conventionally thought to be one's place in society. It sheds no light on what virtue is by nature, although it points to virtue as having something to do with proper human functioning within a household or city. Socrates playfully compares Meno's many virtues to a swarm of bees, not, that is, to the well-ordered hive. A city, or any sort of community, is not a heap, but an interweaving of activities and functions. By making virtue a heap, Meno falsifies the organic wholeness of communal life. Socrates urges Meno to say what all virtues have in common by referring to the one self-same form that makes them all virtues. He says that anyone who was asked about this commonality would, in answering, do well, in Greek, do beautifully, kalos, to look off toward the self-same form of virtue. Form, eidos, comes from the Greek verb meaning to see. An eidos is a look. It can refer to someone's outward appearance. If indeed there is a form that guides inquiry, then speech that tries to define has a goal, a target that is not itself speech. The goal is rather the nonverbal nature we intend and aim at when we try to define something, unless, of course, we are only interested in how the word is used. The eidos is the intelligible correlate of a desired insight into the it of the question, what is it? Not to be confused with an answer, the eidos is a corrective to Meno's obsession with speech, especially portable speech. Meno makes 3 more attempts to answer Socrates' question. Each time, he fails to keep virtue, in Socrates' phrase, whole and healthy. The lack of wholeness in Meno's answers points to a corresponding lack in Meno's soul, which seems to be a disordered heap of desires and of unexamined opinions gotten from others, especially sophists. After his fourth failure, Meno gives up. Having had his soul and mouth stifled by numbfish Socrates, Meno tries to numb Socrates in return. He throws down a clever paradox, a Gorgias-sounding logic trap that seems to make learning impossible. Prior to searching for something, I either know or I don't know. If I know, why search? If I don't, how will I recognize what I want to know, even if I should run into it? Socrates makes no attempt to refute the paradox. Instead, he tells a myth. This is something Socrates does often, but usually not, as here, in the middle of a conversation. Myth in Plato is imaginative, visionary speech that depicts the whole of all things, the cosmos, sub specie aeternitatis, under the look of eternity. In the Meno, Socrates' myth functions as counter-Gorgian rhetoric, designed to persuade Meno that since learning is recollection, there is always hope that with persistent effort, inquiry into the truth will be fruitful. Socrates emphasizes the ethical virtues of courage and endurance. It is the first sign that recollection as the search for virtue involves, and perhaps is even the ground and cause of, being virtuous. Later in the dialogue, right after the slave boy episode, Socrates repeats the bond between ethical and intellectual virtue in even stronger terms. He says that believing that one should seek what one does not know makes us better, more courageous, and less lazy than if we believed that learning was something either impossible or unnecessary. Socrates introduces the myth by piquing Meno's curiosity about what important people say. In this case, priests and priestesses. Ever eager to acquire the sayings of the wise, Meno is so excited by the prospect of acquiring a secret teaching that he interrupts Socrates in mid-sentence. What was the speech they gave? Socrates responds, a true one, as it seems to me, and beautiful. By referring to wise men and women, Socrates emphasizes that both sexes may be equal sharers in things divine. He differs from Meno, who limits a woman's virtue to household management and obedience to her husband. The priests and priestesses to whom Socrates refers are unconventional. Their specialty is not to rave or speak in riddles or preside over sacrifices to the gods, but to give accounts, logoi. The purpose of this account, the myth, is not to preach knowing one's place by showing humility and obedience before the gods, but to spur human beings to persist in their quest for divine wisdom and the life of a god. The myth's central teaching is that the human soul is immortal, that it has been born and has died many times, but is never destroyed. Since this is true, Socrates says, one must live one's life through in the holiest way. By virtue of our common humanity, we have a sacred trust and obligation to care for our souls. As visionary speech about the cosmos, the myth takes us beyond the merely ethical and raises the stakes of our earthly lives. We live not only in the mortal everyday world, but also in the deathless scheme of things, in the light of eternal truths which escape us and are in constant need of being wrested from oblivion. The unidentified poet whom Socrates quotes mentions Persephone, queen of the underworld, who accepts atonement for ancient penthos, grief or misfortune, and sends purified souls back to the sunlit world from Hades. These souls, we are told, grow into great kings remarkable for strength and wisdom. The ancient misfortune here may be the deep-set ignorance of our ignorance, which causes us to pursue evil, thinking it to be good, and from which we need to be delivered, purified by the knowledge of ignorance and the inquiry that this knowledge ought to inspire. Only then can we hope to rule ourselves like great kings. Socrates concludes from the soul's immortality that since the soul has been born many times and has seen all things here and in Hades, there is nothing that it has not learned. The soul can learn in its mortal life because in learning it is recalling not what it has heard, but what it has seen and already knows. Of course, this doesn't explain how the initial learning or coming to know took place. The myth raises all over again the very question it is designed to settle and seems to suggest an infinite regress. The crucial point, however, is that learning is not the result of teaching, but is rather the fruit of the soul's own effort. This effort is grounded in the myth's ontological postulate, the interconnectedness of nature, physis. All of nature is akin, syngenous, and so, if the soul can recall one thing it has seen, then it can, in principle, recall all other things. In other words, the cosmos is a whole, not a heap. Nature here is not the world of plants and animals, but the eternal order of eternal things, the ever-abiding realm of rationally interwoven natures or forms. Because of this eidetic interweaving, the soul can follow the thread of inquiry without fear that there will be tears in the texture of being. Our inquiries are the various journeys in which our souls are rejuvenated, born again, in their attempt to recover forgotten insights, truths of which we are oblivious. The myth is designed to urge Meno to stop being lazy, cowardly, and slavish, and to continue the search for what virtue is. Meno is intrigued by the myth, but then he lapses into his habitual opinion that learning is a mode of getting something from somebody else. He wants Socrates to teach him how learning is recollection. Socrates will do no such thing, but he will show Meno that the claim is true. He will exhibit recollection in, Socrates says, one of Meno's many slaves. The slave boy episode is one of two plays within the play of the Meno. The other is Socrates' prickly conversation with Annapolis, who was one of Socrates' accusers. The first play within the play is to the second as openness is to hostility. The slave boy episode is remarkable for many reasons, more than I can discuss here. It dramatizes an act of genuine learning as the slave, who has no face to lose and no presumption of wealth, intellectual or otherwise, moves from not knowing to knowing how to double a given square. Unlike Meno, he submits to questioning, admits his errors, and evinces wonder, the theme of Mr. Salem's talk. The slave boy does what his master Meno, for the most part, refuses to do, and thereby shows himself to be truly free in soul. The geometrical play within the play highlights something about which the myth is silent, the role of a guide in the recollection process. The slave learns with the help of Socrates, who draws him out. Through a series of well-placed questions, Socrates brings out of the boy's soul various opinions and ultimately a piece of the real knowledge that is sleeping there. What Socrates elicits is not a right answer, but an insight. The quest for the double square shows what Socrates meant when he said that all nature is akin. The word mathematics comes from the Greek verb that means to learn or understand, manthanein. In mathematics, the realm of the eminently learnable, everything is rationally interwoven, and the path to the discovery of the double square is firmly rooted in the beautiful interlacing of natures of beautifully clear objects, number, straight line, and square. These objects, unlike those of our sense perception, are precisely what they are, like the forms. Mathematical inquiry reveals an eternal rather than temporal order among its objects. Later in the dialogue, in the context of distinguishing knowledge from true opinion, Socrates defines recollection as a logismos aitias, a reasoning out of the cause. This process of reasoning out, Socrates says, stabilizes the soul and prevents its opinions from wandering around and fleeing like the beautiful but fugitive statues of Daedalus. To reason out a cause is to go back, not temporally, but logically, back to the ground and reason for a thing or an opinion. We see this reasoning out in the search for the double square, since finding the square means finding the line that is the square's side. This line is the ground and cause, the idea of the sought-for square. The most obvious thing about the example Socrates chooses is also the most interesting. Geometry is visual. It uses images as aids to the intellect. When we engage in geometrical inquiry, we recognize these imperfect likenesses that we draw and consult as just that, imperfect likenesses of the pure objects we intend and about which our speech is precisely true. We rely on our imagination, about which we shall hear more from Miss Doherty. Imagination, eikasia, appears on the divided line in the Republic. It is our ability not to make or receive an image, but to recognize an image as an image. Jacob Klein discusses this wondrous power of the soul in his commentary on the Meno. By choosing a geometrical example, Socrates tries yet again to counteract and cure Meno's obsession with speech. To follow a geometric demonstration, we must look at the diagram. The image keeps thought and speech honest by providing a focus and guide. Gorgian rhetoric has no place here. In questioning the slave boy, Socrates subtly leads him into error. He nudges him toward thinking that doubling the side of the given square will produce the double square. This is one of the most revealing moments in the search. The reason is that the wrong square, which is 4 times that of the given square, becomes the clue to the discovery of the double square, which, you recall, Socrates inscribes on its edge in the quadruple square. Far from being merely wrong, the quadruple square is integral to the search. It points somewhere, indeed, to the solution of the problem. Similarly, Meno's failed attempts to define virtue, his opinions, point somewhere, not indeed to a solution, as in the geometric example, but to deeper disclosures and discoveries. As word images, they point to and capture, however partially, some truth yet to be revealed in its wholeness. Finally, there is the curious nature of the line that is the double square's ground and cause. As you know, this line is incommensurable with respect to the square's side. The two lines have no common measure and do not have the ratio, the logos, of a number to a number. Number, arithmos, pervades Socrates' questioning of the slave boy. The problem of doubling a square is all about the connection between a continuous and a discrete magnitude, between a geometrical object, a square, and an arithmetical object, 2. But in the case of the line that yields the double square, number fails. To the question, how long is this line, no answer can be given. It is impossible to say how many times a given length is contained in this line, since it has no common measure with the square's side. The line is, in the strict sense, speechless, allogon. I can draw, point to, and see this line, but I cannot say it. In posing this geometrical problem as exhibiting learning as recollection, Socrates underscores the precedence of seeing over saying in the act of learning. Saying is, of course, necessary to the recollective process. Through questions and answers, we strive for insight. But the line that solves the problem of the double square, defies speech. Like the eidos I mentioned earlier, it is something to be seen rather than said. As the inquiry reaches its end and the sought-for square comes to light, Socrates asks the slave boy to identify the line that produces the required square. He asks, "From what sort of line?" The slave boy points and responds, "From this one." Socrates notes in passing that the sophists, some of whom were mathematicians, have a name for it, diagonal. The name is useful, as are all terms of art. But in this case, the name covers over the nature of the thing named, since the line, as we have seen, is unsayable. In posing the problem of the double square, Socrates has located within the art of geometry a dissonance between seeing and saying. He has demonstrated, for Meno's sake, an act of genuine learning in which speech, though potent, shows its limit. The slave boy episode fails to persuade Meno to continue the search for what virtue is. He insists on wanting to know how virtue is acquired. Socrates attributes Meno's stubbornness to a warped view of freedom and a lack of self-governance. But since you don't even attempt to rule yourself, no doubts that you may be free, you attempt to rule me, and do rule me, I shall yield to you. For what am I to do? At a loss to move Meno, Socrates relents cunningly. He suggests that they inquire into how virtue is acquired by means of a hypothesis, the kind that geometers sometimes employ. If virtue is a kind of knowledge, then it would be acquired through teaching. This is, of course, precisely what the myth of recollection was at pains to deny. The long final act of the drama puts forth the promising idea that the cause, the aitia, of all good effects in the realm of human action is phronesis, thoughtfulness or practical wisdom. Socrates, however, mixes this promising idea with the conventional opinion that knowledge is teachable. He makes the further assumption that didakton, which can mean either teachable or taught, here means taught. He does so, it seems, to expose the dearth of teachers of political wisdom, especially in Athens. Socrates kicks the hornet's nest. He goads sophist-hating Anytus into admitting that the much-admired standard-bearers of Athenian excellence, men like Themistocles and Pericles, fail to educate their sons in the most needful thing, the art of rule. In a roundabout way, by dismantling the assumption that wisdom is teachable, the conversation points back to recollection and the inherent goodness of inquiry. Like Eros in the Symposium, inquiry is the offspring of providedness and poverty, poros and penia. Inquiry is the being at work of acknowledged ignorance. By freely yielding to its rigors and risks, as the slave boy does, we gain deeper insight not only into the objects of our search, but also into the grounds of perplexity and error. Our souls are made healthy through self-questioning and are stabilized by the reasoning out of causes and our ever-renewed familiarity with the wandering to which opinions are subject. The Meno, together with the Phaedo and other dialogues, points to philosophic inquiry as the soul's effort to recall obliviated insights into the most original objects of thought. These are the forms, the intellected beings that constitute the interrelated whole of nature. But recollection in human life is not confined to the search for deathless truth. It is also, and often, a going back that recalls a place, an experience, or a human being we hold dear. The dialogues are recollections in just this sense. They are provocations to the deepest thought, but they are also a personal tribute to the human being Plato held most dear, the man Socrates, who was Plato's muse. This weekend we celebrate Eva Brann, who is dear to us all and who has been a muse to many. In her writings, lectures, essays, and conversations, Eva has given us an example of recollection as a way of life. Eva started out as an archaeologist, one who unearths and studies things long past, things archaic. But then she became, to coin a word, an archaeologist, one who unearths and studies archae, principles, origins, and sources, the roots of things, to borrow from the title of Miss Silver's talk tomorrow morning. As archaeologist, Eva, in her many journeys and excavations, has unearthed insights into the imagination, time, non-being, feelings, the will, the songs of Homer, the music of the Republic, and the logos of Heraclitus. She has gone back and has taken us back with her to the founding of the American Republic, the world of Jane Austen, and the fascinating civilization of the Aztecs. We thank you, Eva. I thank you for your rich recollections and for all that you have given to your friends, colleagues, and students, to our college, and to the world. Viva Eva.
Now I understand what people mean when they talk about things being hard acts to follow. Okay. Let me start with a few preliminary comments. I know there's a kind of unusual variety in the audience tonight. Some people will not have read yet some of the things I'm going to talk about. Other people will know these things much better than I do. I'm going to try to speak fairly clearly so that maybe people who don't have experience of these things will be able to benefit from it. I hope that doesn't result in boredom in people that do know them well. That's one thing. The second thing I want to do is say, I want to assure you that there's absolutely nothing original in my talk. I probably learned most of this in one way or another from Eva at some point, but in any case, I don't think there's anything really new here for me. And another thing, for the purposes of this talk, philosophy includes mathematics and natural science. I think that's fitting here because the works I'm going to be talking about presuppose that. And then the final thing I want to say is that I know there's already been some talk about Eva today. Mr. Kalkavage did it. There'll probably be more tomorrow. I think I'm not really supposed to talk about Eva, but I'm going to do it anyway, at least a little. Anyway, this brief inquiry, or really brief sketch of an inquiry, is meant to have an Eva-esque cast to it. I figure it's the least I can do, since in one way or another, Eva has been there at every step of my intellectual life, shaping how I think and what I think about. If you like, you can think of this talk as karma or payback, but in a good sense. The gods who decide these things sent me to her freshman math tutorial as a callow 17-year-old boy. And it was partly that experience, watching students do and think about mathematics under her firm but friendly guidance, that convinced me that St. John's was the place for me. Her essays on the Odyssey and Republic taught me a lot about how to read during my undergraduate years, while her essays on Jane Austen, Kant, and any number of other authors got me through rough patches in graduate school. And once I returned to St. John's as a newbie tutor, my first year as tutor was her first year as dean, Eva served for me as a cross between philosopher queen and fairy godmother. A fairy godmother when she kept me off onerous committees in my early years, although at some point I started to wonder, was she protecting me from committees or committees from me? Anyway, and a philosopher queen when she repeatedly gave me wise advice about how to conduct my classes, and even more when she agreed to read a small stretch of the Sophist with me one summer at the rate of a few sentences per session, an experience in no-holds-barred conversation about philosophic matters, which I believe led directly to our trio of translating the Sophist. And then the next thing I want to just say is that I've been talking about myself and my relation to Eva for the last page, but really she has just worked the same way for so many people, and that's part of what I think we should acknowledge today. I just remember that she kept her door open for all the tutors who showed up when I showed up, for instance. Okay. What do I mean when I say that I have given my talk an Eva-esque cast? Eva has written a great many essays about single authors and single texts. I've already mentioned a few. But starting in the early 90s, she also began writing what one might call reflective compendia. That is, books that take some single important notion, imagination, time, non-being, the passions, the will, and spell out thoughtfully everything that has ever been said about it. These books are amazing, and if you haven't read at least one, you should. If you have a lot of time on your hands and are tired of reading Proust, try the Imagination book. It clocks in at 800 pages. Or the book on the Passions, a mere 500. If you have less time, try the Time book. It's not much more than 200 pages of finely worked, thought-laden prose about an unintelligible topic. Now, I am not capable of that kind of work. I'm the first person to admit that. I lack the brain power and even more, the industry. But I'm going to try for a pale, playful imitation tonight, just for the fun of it and as a tribute to Eva, who once told me, in jest, I think, that she had read 660 books and articles to prepare for the writing of one of her books. I'm going for 3 authors and some unfounded assertions about a few others. That leaves me off by a factor of 222, but I figure it's thought that counts, or rather, the thought that counts. Here is to Eva. Okay. Near the beginning of the Theaetetus, Socrates tells that thoroughly confused young man who has just reported that he is overwhelmed by wonder when he entertains certain questions, that he needn't worry. This feeling of wonder, quote, very much belongs to the philosopher, end quote. And in fact, quote, there is no other beginning for philosophy than this one, end quote. A point Socrates sums up nicely by noting that the messenger goddess Iris, the stand-in for philosophy here, is the child of Thauma, wonder. Aristotle picks up on and echoes this claim near the beginning of the Metaphysics when he says, while repeatedly associating wonder and perplexity, that, quote, human beings both now and at first began to philosophize on account of wondering, end quote. I should add that this passage forms the capstone for Aristotle's argument that wisdom, Sophia, and love of wisdom, philosophia, are not meant for further use. They have their good in themselves. The mere presence of wonder is, for Aristotle, a sure sign that understanding is being pursued simply for its own sake. Should we agree with Aristotle and Socrates about the philosophic primacy of wonder? That's what I want to think about tonight. about that and about what exactly Socrates and Aristotle mean by wonder and the activity of wondering. I won't be able to answer either of these questions in the time allotted to me. My hope here is to make a start. Now, I imagine some of you are thinking, what a waste of time. There's really nothing to reflect on here. Everyone knows what wonder means, and anyone who's ever had a serious conversation with friends or companions, and you have, already knows that such conversations are always sparked by wonder in at least one of the participants. Wonder is the very element of philosophical thinking, full stop. We don't need no stinking lecture to tell us about wonder. That may be so, but I can think of at least one very great thinker who goes out of his way to deny that philosophy depends in some essential way on wonder. And if truth be told, I think the situation is also more complicated in the case of Socrates and Aristotle than it might appear. The thinker I have in mind is Descartes. Take The Passions of the Soul, Descartes' last book. Here, Descartes narrows the meaning of wonder to surprise in the face of what is new or strange, and mocks those who wonder too much. In his hands, wonder devolves into curiosity and is not bound up in any significant way with philosophy. At most, it can become a kind of spur to scientific investigation. In such a case, wonder becomes interest, as when one scientist says to another, "I'm interested in glowworms," or perhaps glowworm mating behavior. How about you? Miss Brann, as usual, nails the distinction between these two types of wonder. This modern wonder, here's a quote, this modern wonder differs toto kailo, by a whole world, from the old Socratic wonder. The former, modern wonder, is a non-marveling astonishment at something extraordinary. The latter was a marveling perplexity aroused by something very ordinary, end quote. Or let's consider another text of Descartes, the preface to the Meteorology. Here, Descartes takes another tack. Instead of pushing the old meaning of wonder aside and separating wonder from philosophy, he positively declares war on it, or at least declares war on the natural human tendency to wonder at what goes on in the sky and heavens above us. His expressed goal here, as natural philosopher, is to bring it about that, quote, we no longer have occasion to wonder at or admire anything of that sort. He's referring in the first instance to clouds and the like, but by the end of the passage, he is saying simply everything above. And I take it he's certainly thinking of the rainbow, but in the end, I think he's got to be thinking about all the motions of the heavens too. Or to finally pick another text, pick another last text, the Discourse on Method, Descartes' philosophical, or consider finally the Discourse on Method, Descartes' philosophical autobiography. Suppose for just a moment that Aristotle had written such a book. It would probably be a story of evolving perplexities, a tale of all the things that kept young and not so young Aristotle up at night. We get no such thing in the Discourse. As far as I can tell, there is no trace, no whisper, no soupçon of wonder in it. Instead, we get, as a starting point for Descartes' philosophical awakening, a kind of intellectual malaise or indigestion. In Descartes' own telling, he was a great student at one of the best schools in France. He studied everything he was supposed to, did a lot of extra reading on the side, and was destined to become a scholar of some kind. And yet, he says, at the end of his studies, I found, quote, I found myself embarrassed with so many doubts and errors that there seemed to have been no other benefit in trying to instruct myself except that I had discovered more and more my own ignorance, end quote. The word embarrassé here has, I should note, nothing to do with embarrassment or shame. Shame is not Descartes' thing. Instead, it means encumbered or blocked or burdened. In this case, it means that Descartes finds himself at the end of his formal studies in a labyrinth of doubt and error, a state of perplexity that resembles Socratic aporia in certain respects, but that is instead universal in scope. Descartes has lost confidence in his education as a whole. The sole exception is mathematics. He can go nowhere with this education, and so he must reject it en masse. Universal blockage points to a need for universal rejection, which in turn points to a need for a new, universal, and unshakable foundation for knowledge, a foundation located within the self, and a new, equally universal approach to seeking knowledge. Wonder of the old-fashioned sort has no place in this new order, certainly as regards natural philosophy, because all questions of natural philosophy will henceforth be reframed as problems to be resolved within the pre-given framework, the framework of mathematical physics. At any rate, that's the plan. Now, I should say right off that I don't fully buy into the picture of Descartes I've just presented for several reasons. First, it's very hard for me to believe that one can engage in the kind of intense and perfectly remarkable intellectual work that Descartes did without occasionally experiencing something like Socratic wonder. And second, I suspect that Descartes is more interested in projecting a certain image of himself in the discourse and elsewhere than he is in accurately representing his interior state. He wants his present and future readers to see him as the intrepid explorer and founder who despises book learning and thinks for himself, not as a matter of personal vanity, or not just that, but because he wants them to take him as a model. He wants to refound philosophy, set it in a new key, and that requires generating a new image of the philosopher as one not beset by perplexity, not affected or infected by wonder, but self-sufficient, capable of generating all knowledge from himself alone. Sorry. Does he succeed? Yes and no. I think the self-assertion and system building that characterize so much of philosophy proper owe something to Descartes and his rejection of the old Socratic wonder. So that's a yes, I suppose. The near total disappearance until Nietzsche of any discussion of wonder or the philosophic value of wonder might also be credited to Descartes. In natural philosophy, I think the picture is more complex. The hordes of citizen scientists who swarmed and no doubt still swarm the English countryside in search of bugs and other vermin. Think of Mr. Fairbrother in Middlemarch and his carefully labeled drawers full of specimens. Might seem to some observers to have succumbed entirely to Descartes' substitution of curiosity for Socratic wonder. But I'm not so sure. Perhaps the Mr. Fairbrothers of the world, and their academic counterparts too, are in fact moved by a kind of proto-wonder. Perhaps they too are heeding Aristotle's Heraclitean call. Here too, there are gods. As for natural philosophy in the form of physics, well, in its detail, Descartes' physics falls apart very quickly within a generation or two, and the mathematics changes as well. But what doesn't change is the commitment to laws of nature, especially conservation laws, and that means that what doesn't change is a commitment to understanding nature in strictly mathematical terms. In this sense, Descartes' wonder-free vision for natural philosophy remains firmly in place. Or does it? When I think about some scientists and some mathematicians, I find I cannot shake the feeling that the sketch I'm making is incomplete. When, for instance, I picture Maxwell with Faraday's researches on one side of his desk and Weber's action at a distance account on the other, and lots of other papers and studies piled up between them, when I picture this Maxwell in this state, thinking about his pile of texts, pondering the vast range of electromagnetic phenomena, and trying to formulate one account to rule and gather them all, I feel driven to ascribe something like Socratic wonder to him. And what about Einstein, who apparently arrived at some of his greatest discoveries by noticing the incongruities that emerge when one contemplates the whole structure of physics together with the elementary quantities and assumptions upon which it is built? I am tempted to say that what we have in such cases is what I'll call second intentional wonder, by which I mean not second-rate wonder, but wonder that is mediated by already developed theories, and that is therefore no longer quite the marveling perplexity aroused by something very ordinary that Eva had been talking about, but also not completely separate from it either. I could go on to talk, say, about Newton or some of the founders of quantum mechanics who demanded a return to fundamental notions, or certain mathematicians who, operating in realms where Descartes might expect thought to be perfectly transparent to itself, find themselves saying things like, "I see it, but I don't believe it." In these cases, too, it looks as if the very attempt to squash wonder may have resulted in its return at a higher level, and in precisely those who take the enterprise most seriously. But perhaps this is a topic best left for later. It's time we look more closely at what Aristotle and Socrates say about wonder. Let me return one last time, to Miss Brand's suggestion that genuine wonder, or at least wonder in its original form, is perplexity aroused by the very ordinary. This seems absolutely right to me when I think about the examples Socrates gives at various places in the dialogues. In the Republic, when he imagines a person becoming baffled as he looks at his fingers, or in the Phaedo, when he describes his own always recurring wonder that two can be the result of both putting together and taking away. But I'm less sure when I think about Aristotle's list of wonder-generating examples, namely puppets, in this order, puppets, solstices, and incommensurability. Let's leave puppets to one side. I have some thoughts about why they appear on the list, but this is not the place to air them. Okay. But as for solstices and incommensurability, well, it's true solstices are linked to the changing of seasons, and that changing is part of our everyday experience. And likewise, as Mr. Kalkavage pointed out, incommensurability is there the moment I draw a diagonal through a square. But recognizing incommensurability as a fact and understanding it as a problem, and noticing the astonishing way that sunset and sunrise positions form a perfectly determinate yet puzzling pattern over the course of the year, these take thought and questions and more thought and more questions. My point, or first point, is that the objects that give rise to wonder in this account are not exactly simple, and that wonder never just comes out of nowhere. Philosophic wonder belongs to a life in which thinking is already going on. A point Plato gives beautiful illustration, almost comic illustration to, in the very opening sentences of the dialogue of the Theaetetus, when a fellow named Terpsion says, "In fact, I was searching for you, Zetain, in the marketplace, and wondering, Thaumazein, that I couldn't find you, Hurein." It's like all the language of philosophic inquiry is built in this very ordinary way in the first sentence. But this leads me to a second point about wonder. At the beginning of this talk, I had Socrates say about wonder in my translation, "There is no other beginning for philosophy than this one." The word I translated as beginning here was arche, which can mean beginning, but also a number of other things as well: starting point, source, origin, rule, and even cause. I propose that what it really means here is ruling cause. Wonder presides over philosophy. It is philosophy. It is there whenever philosophy is, or rather, wondering is. I've been using the noun wonder as a sort of shorthand. What Socrates actually says is, this pathos, wondering, to thaumazein, very much belongs to the philosopher. The articular infinitive tells me wonder is not some sort of passive state. It is there and at work whenever philosophy is. And now 2 more comments about words. I translated pathos as feeling earlier, but I wonder whether it really means condition here. Wonder is a pathos insofar as it is prompted by something I feel as outside of me in some sense of outside. It's not self-generated in some obvious sense, but it is more than a mere feeling, in spite of Descartes' classification of wonder as a passion of the soul. In fact, I suspect that Socrates and Aristotle too regard wonder, or rather wondering, as an activity of the intellect as philosophizing. And now for my final comment about a word, and more or less my final comment in this presentation. In every dictionary or other resource I've looked at, thaumazein, wondering, is linked to the word to see, and the word that turns up in words like theoretical and theorem. So the wondering that presides over philosophy and is a type of intellectual activity is something like seeing. But this is very strange. Theaetetus himself describes his wondering as literally spinning in darkness. And this characterization seems perfectly compatible with Aristotle's identification of wondering with being perplexed. He says that 3 times. How can being in the dark, being at an impasse, being without resource, be a kind of seeing? Here is my proposal. It can be if wonder is to knowing as motion is to sheer activity, sheer being at work. Or again, it can be if the point is not to avoid perplexity at all costs, but to accept it, find order find order within perplexity and move through it until, if you're lucky, seeing in the dark becomes seeing simply. Thank you.